a lot of things that people think about urban warfare are through movies and romantic or romanticized portrayal of different urban fights. When just the history is full of that's not the way it goes. To include U.S. military forces who believe that's the way the fight's going, like I said, even in these protracted fights when the military thinks it's going to go house to house, and they learn quickly like that's not the type of fight you're in.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and a contributor to the Bulwark. And I'm joined by my partner in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Eliot, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well, Eric. I'm recovering from actually a glorious week with my grandchildren, several of my grandchildren, not all of them, in the Catskills, where, among other things, I went bowling for the first time in like 45 years. And I wasn't good then.
How'd you do?
I'd rather not discuss it. Let's go on to our let's go on to our
I feel you, bro.
So it's we're really very fortunate to have with us this week one of the country's leading experts, if not the leading expert, on the subject, the rather grim subject of urban warfare. And that's John Spencer, who is chair of war studies at the Madison Policy Forum and executive director of the Urban Warfare Institute. He had a distinguished military career, starting off as an enlisted man, rising to become a sergeant first class, then commissioned, then major on active duty, and continues to be active on a part-time basis with the California State Guard. John Spencer had 2 Iraq tours, first the initial invasion and then in the Battle of Sadr City in 2008. We'll draw you out a bit on that because that was, I think it's fair to say, together with Fallujah, some of the more intense and illuminating episodes of urban warfare the United States experienced in Iraq. The author of many good articles and several books, and I'll just tick off the names. With Liam Collins, Understanding Urban Warfare, a book on morale and motivation, Connected Soldiers, Life, Leadership, and Social Connections in Modern War, and then a short work that he wrote rather quickly to help the Ukrainians in 2022, The Mini Manual for the Urban Defender. So with all that, John Spencer, let me wish you a warm welcome to Shield of the Republic and say how glad we are to have you with us.
Thank you, Eliot. Thank you, Eric. And thanks for that introduction. It's a great privilege to be with you as a longtime student in strategic studies, of course, of your work, and excited about the conversation.
Great. So maybe if I could just kick it off to help our listeners, particularly those who are not soldiers or really students of modern warfare, what is it that is distinctive about urban warfare? And how do you have to think differently about it, than you do about the kinds of things that, we normally think about warfare with, tanks rolling across the countryside and so forth?
Yeah, you'd think that's a simple question, but it's actually not. And one of the reasons I have a lot of job security is that it is very complex. But the short answer is, what makes it so difficult, because unlike all other terrains in which a military might try to achieve a goal, a political goal, is that urban warfare, by definition, is happening in urban terrain. So where there's a population, lots of man-made construction and infrastructure to support that population. On top of that, though, militaries, whether they follow the law of war or not, are constrained. The evolution of the laws of war. As soon as you enter the urban environment, it is where the most constraints on the use of force are present, because rightfully so, the law of war has evolved to lessen the cost on the populations and their infrastructure as we fight wars. there's the information operations space, no other terrain. If you have a war in a jungle or a battle, not every tree has a cell phone, but you enter the urban environment. Now we fight and there's not just cell phones, traffic cameras, satellites, you name it. So the information operations domain is vastly different in the urban terrain. And then lastly, to make it as short as I can, although we teach week-long courses on this, is that the challenge is ourselves. I'm sure we'll talk about the history of urban warfare, but the biggest challenge for lots of militaries, to include even the United States military, is that we avoid it at all cost. And that drives the way we think about how to achieve a goal, whether it's, people say I talk about tactics, but operationally, strategically, of course, the goal is to avoid those urban fights for all those reasons I just talked about. So one of the reasons that it's so hard is that to this day, militaries and governments avoid and bypass it as much as they can. They used to write it into their books to do that. Now they don't, but they essentially cognitively still do.
Could I just follow up on that and then hand things over to Eric for a bit? Could you talk in particular about the U.S. military's history of urban warfare? Because if my memory doesn't fail me, one of the first episodes of urban warfare, I think, is the siege of Cerro Gordo and the Mexican War, where they're actually doing some of the standard tactics of breaking through walls rather than going through doors and stuff like that. But it's really not till World War II, with things like the Battle of Aachen or the Battle of Manila, which actually came at a very, very heavy cost in civilian casualties, that you see the United States engaging in it. And then the impression I have, of course, then you have things like Wei during Vietnam, but you do get the impression that the United States military, until at least sometime in the 80s, really shied away from having to think through the issue of urban warfare. Is that a fair assessment?
It's a pretty fair assessment. And again, I have my own podcasts, although I don't consider myself a podcaster, that I've been doing for 6 years, where I try to address every element of this. And I do really enjoy the case studies that I do, going back and looking at those wars from Stalingrad and, like you said, American experiences in Aachen, or same thing as the Canadians in World War II in Ortona, Wei. We have a history of fighting, although for cities, but not necessarily in cities. And that's really for all militaries. I mean, if you go to Civil War, you have like the Battle of Petersburg and others that are on the outskirts of a city. And if you think about, even when I first joined the military, I was stationed in Panama, remembering the Battle of Panama City. But fighting in the depth of cities, even if you look at the invasion of Iraq, the Battle of Baghdad, I'm going to have General Perkins on my podcast soon. It's not much of a fight inside of the city for a bunch of reasons. So for a lot of people to generalize, like the history of it, when there's, the goals are different and what happens in the events, where you're right to point out these battles that almost defy logic, and like the Battle of Aachen, which is a political battle, as much as like the Battle of Bakhmut might be, where tactically it doesn't make any sense to have this very protracted, destructive war inside of that. But war's political goals, even Stalingrad, like there's no reason for that fight to happen. It has the name of the opposition leader and it becomes a political fight. For the U.S. military, though, you're right. There are some evolutions there, as I've tracked even like the tactics that are passed on from kind of counterinsurgency, counterterrorism fighting, and then applied in macro. And then you get into a battle like the Second Battle of Fallujah, where they're trying to enter in clear rooms using tactics that are meant for a different type of fight versus these city assaults. So I had this other line of research just looking at city assaults when a defender has gotten into urban terrain and held it for a certain amount of time. You're right. For the U.S. military, there are a few outside of the Battle of Wei where the NVA and the VC get inside the city and there's a protracted fight over liberating the city. The Second Battle of Fallujah is the largest battle of the entire Iraq War. So bigger than the Battle of Baghdad, which is a city of 6 million. And then you got to ask, well, why is that? And there's some reasons there. And then you fast forward for the U.S. military's even assistance in a battle called the Battle of Mosul in 2016, which is, we're not fighting it, we're providing the air cover, but it's the biggest battle since World War II. And most people that don't want to spend the time aren't asking like, well, why those battles? Why are those battles so protracted? Because if they're really the kind of one of the precursor strategies in even a war or a battle is if you can get into the urban terrain, you get immense advantages. And even if it's an American, the Americans did get to certain urban areas, and whether you look at like the Battle of the Bulge or others, where if you can anchor yourself near an urban terrain, you get a lot of advantages. So once you get into the urban terrain, if you can seed yourself in there, it's called the great equalizer. Eliot's question is right. The U.S. military has avoided it. Like I said, and I was a part of some of those doctrinal rewrites of like, we got to take that line out of there that commanders should avoid and bypass it at all costs, just by the evolution of population growth and the evolution of urbanization. Like, there's battles happening in Ukraine that before there wasn't an urban area in that space, even in World War II. Now there's massive urban areas. Even if you look at the Battle of Kyiv, what it is today isn't what it was before. The level of depth of thinking about urban warfare for the U.S. military is only wedded in a history that is very sporadic in cases. And like you said, Sadr City is a very unique case. And it wasn't until I went back to write the case study that I really understood how unique that battle was in the history of urban warfare and how the U.S. military was constrained, and then what that turned it into being the tactics that were used.
I'm glad you mentioned the Battle of Baghdad, John, because I recall quite well before the decisions were made to go into Iraq that it was a big question about what would happen if and when the U.S. military, the Marines and the Army got to Baghdad. And I remember people asserting, uniformed folk, asserting that, well, this would be like Stalingrad. It would be terrible. How are we going to do this? And then, as you point out, in the end of the day, it didn't. It was an urban battle, but it didn't go the way people anticipated. Why was that, do you think?
So the enemy always gets a vote. So in the Battle of Baghdad, the U.S. forces believed that it would be heavily defended, not just in the Karbala Gap, where they thought the unit would be forward of the city, and they thought they were going to have a big battle there. But even within the city, they thought like the Fayadeen and the irregular paramilitaries would be this giant force that would join in the military defense of it. But it goes to once General Perkins and that thunder runs that were never planned, and you have this almost what we call raising a flag, is that the military just evaporates and doesn't fight because it's acknowledged that it's cognitively defeated. And there isn't this radicalized population of militarized formations that are resisting the U.S. military at that time. So it was you got to prepare for those type of fights, but it ended up not being that fight, not because of a lot of planning, a lot of cognitive. You think about the air operations before. It was all almost unimaginable that the Baghdad would fall. Not easily. They were still fighting, and not to give the U.S. forces credit, but that it wouldn't be defended. Even the preparations, right? So it isn't like Saddam didn't know that was coming. There is some element of, like we'll talk about in my manual, I can teach anybody, a civilian, how to turn every street into a battlefield and stop any military. I don't care what their technologies are. And the Iraqi paramilitary forces and military didn't do that.
What are some of the things that you think people in general are most likely to misunderstand about urban warfare? That when I say people, I mean people who are not soldiers, people who have not experienced any of it firsthand, people who are just following the news.
I think people don't understand, and you get this, I'm sure, with students more than I do, is that what the objectives of the war battle might be. And then what are the context of it? Everything down to the physical terrain, right? So in urban warfare, I study cities. So why would a city like Bakhmut hold for so long versus another city that might fall in a couple of days? And the history of that city, the geography of that city, even Baghdad's diversity in neighborhoods and design. I don't know if there's one thing that I can point out that people get wrong. I think a lot of times people have a misconception about the fight being that house to house, room to room fighting. That is a lot of things that people think about urban warfare are through movies and romanticized portrayal of different urban fights. When just the history is full of that's not the way it goes. To include U.S. military forces who believe that's the way the fight's going, like I said, even in these protracted fights when the military thinks it's going to go house to house, and they learn quickly like that's not the type of fight you're in. And that you can't have a dogmatic approach to urban warfare when there are actually cities that are defeated. And I just got back from Azerbaijan, studying a city that's been fought over many times, when it isn't this wall-to-wall fight. It's actually infiltrating inside the city to achieve that cognitive load. So in the city in Susha in Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijanis scale a cliff that nobody thinks is scalable and get inside the city. So some of those ancient stories actually still apply today. And if you, just like Russia tried in Kyiv, had they gotten to the government center in the center of the battle, we wouldn't be having the same conversations we are today about Ukraine's survival.
Is there something peculiar about the cognitive side of urban warfare that makes it different? I mean, it's all war is about emotion and the images that people paint for themselves. I mean, our friend Clausewitz talks plenty about that. But urban warfare, I seem to hear you saying is that there's a different kind of cognitive dimension sometimes. Is that right?
Absolutely, and the resources are different, right? So again, if a lot of times people believe an urban fight is between the attacker and the defender. Well, what about all those millions of people that are in that city? They could either be neutral to the fight and be hiding in a basement, or they could be aggressive and be a part of the enemy situation. The cognitive, absolutely there. I mean, this is why the history of war is about cities. It's fighting for cities because that's where the political capital is, the economic engine of the nation, whether it's a military resource. There are so many nuances, but if a city falls, like a capital city falls, you could win the war. Although, yes, there is a case of Napoleon in Russia, and that not happening. But in general, you can achieve a cognitive objective in the city that is unlike any others. A lot of people try to narrow down war in general to just the destruction of the other military, killing every member of the other military. In the urban environment, that cognitive why you're fighting or how the fighting ends, absolutely different than any other terrain.
What about, let's maybe go to the Battle of Sadr City. I know that Eliot wanted to talk about it. David Johnson wrote a pretty good monograph for Rand on that war, the late David Johnson. And I remember the fight myself while I was in government. Talk a little bit about that and what was sort of unique about the way we approached that fight. I mean, Sadr City, for our benefit of our listeners, was a heavily Shia neighborhood of Baghdad, and therefore was extraordinarily politically sensitive. So,
absolutely, and just Dave Johnson was my mentor as an early soldier, or early officer, getting into academic, and taught me what I know about research. So to continue that work, not only have I been a veteran of that battle, but also then to write my own case study of the Battle of Sadr City. And I would talk to him daily, and I truly miss him.
And Dave did not have the benefit of the 2-volume official history of the U.S. Army in Iraq, which obviously added a lot of detail.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I just had General McMaster on my podcast to discuss the Battle of Tal Afar, which is another quintessential battle in the Iraq War evolution, and I used the Iraq history as kind of the scene setter to discussing that battle that he commanded, which a lot of people have a misconception of what happened there. Sadr City, though, having been there, was a very politically sensitive battle. Sadr City being a neighborhood built by Saddam for basically Shia workers. People talk about Gaza being 2 million. The population of this neighborhood of Baghdad in Sadr City is 2 million, a higher density, all compacted into a certain area. And versus the Shia Sunni divide, at the time, there's actually battles uprising of the Shia kind of opposition to the Iraqi government. There's the Jaish al-Mahdi and Sadrist force that is happening in Najaf and in Sadr City, were the two main arms of this opposition to a coalition government in Iraq. The battle, though, is where there's a planned Iraqi operation against Najaf. Sadr activates the paramilitary, and we're sitting in Baghdad just doing counterinsurgency operations, and all of a sudden the entire world explodes around us as this paramilitary that is emanating from Sadr City, which was already a no-go zone. So basically you had a city within a city that the Iraqi government had deemed a no-go zone for U.S. forces outside of a few special operations. That doesn't sound right, but you couldn't go into Sadr City. So we, at the time, even had segments of walls and checkpoints going in and out of Sadr City. And then there was this explosion called the March Madness in 2008, where the Sadrist, he had activated the Jaish al-Mahdi and started attacking mostly Iraqi security checkpoints, but also the Sons of Iraq checkpoints. So there was basically an operation against the Sadrists to stop there's a lot of similarities here to Gaza. The Sadrists started launching rockets out of Sadr City to hit the green zone, which became the strategic issue, right? So you talk about tactics, and I was involved with the tactics, but the strategic issue was we got to get the rockets to stop coming out of Sadr City and hitting the green zone. So then it became really a battle of rocket launching points, because the Sadrists had to come out of Sadr City to launch their rockets, which had a short range, into the green zone. So at first we launched the operation with that intent. But also probably one of the only ones I've ever studied where the operation is to degrade the enemy's capability, but you can't go to where they're at. You can't go into their city. So it evolves to, we start to discover actually some lower level commanders that if you put a wall that limits the Sadr military from coming out of Sadr City, then that will really will stop them from shooting rockets and limit their capability. We didn't realize at the time, which is interesting from the history, that the wall that we started putting up was called the Gold Wall, also separated the enemy, Sadrists, from its financial support, which was a market just on the other side of this wall called the Jamiliya Market. So through the process, then the operation became putting up a wall around the enemy. So it's almost like a reverse siege, a circumventing. We started putting a wall around Sadr City so that you couldn't go in or out unless you went through a very heavily manned checkpoint. But the enemy also came out to fight the putting in the wall. So for U.S. militaries, most people remember Sadr City as just a concrete emplacement operation where you would go every day, all night, 24 hours a day, putting in concrete walls. The enemy would come out and fight that, though, because it felt like it had to, which then did what is the biggest challenge really in these type of urban fights, which is to separate the enemy from the civilian population. So when they would come out to attack the wall, then it was easier to kill them as a clear, legitimate military target. And eventually the enemy attrits itself by fighting the wall, no resources going into it, to the point where you achieve the political goal, which is Muqtada al-Sadr agreeing to a settlement, stop shooting rockets, and stand down his military.
You know, you were in that battle. I am curious what you think that you bring to the world of scholarship or study of urban warfare from having been a soldier on the front lines of it. And by the way, I just want to add my tribute to Dave Johnson. He was a wonderful human being, on top of being a formidable scholar and a formidable officer. And he passed away much too young.
So it's been interesting, and thanks to his mentorship, like my experiences, of course, gave me a tacit knowledge of the challenge of the individual soldier. But one of the first things he taught us, as he commanded the strategic studies group for the chief of staff of the Army, and that's what I was a part of, was, in God I trust, all others bring data. So what he taught me was, look, your experiences are great. Now do the work of interviewing the commanders across the echelon on what they were being told. So I think I have a very tactical lens, and it's been really interesting to go back as I now have traveled the world. And how do you study a war? How do you tell really to write the case study of a war. Like, what is the information you need? I now look back and understand how little I knew, which also means that other people who are in battles, and I've done this for hundreds of battles, of that person knows about this much of the battle. And as you know, there are political decisions, as I have discovered, and I did not know them at the time, that were directing what we could or couldn't do. And that on the day to day, I was able to go back now and translate, oh, that's why we were doing that, because there are these 4 echelons that the soldier doesn't need to know at the time that are making up the full picture of why everything is happening. And I've done that now for, all the first Battle of Fallujah, second Battle of Fallujah. Everybody is like, you identify the gaps of what you know and what you need to know in order to tell this story.
Interesting. Let me ask you another question, which actually, I think it arises out of the Sadr City and the Fallujah story, but it also, I think, applies to the Israeli experience in Gaza, but also much earlier in Jenin, which I think was the first time where they really went into a very dense urban area. I forget when that was. Was that sometime in
2002?
2002. Yeah, I was going to say I thought it was sometime in the early aughts. And that is, I think what most people would say is, well, boy, urban warfare is just enormously costly unless you simply whistle up, the B-52s and you level the whole city, which is usually not what you can do or what you want to do. Is that true?
Absolutely not. Again, the context really matters. Even if you were to study the Battle of Jenin in 2002, highly destructive, you would have to do that in parallel with the Battle of Nablus, which was less destructive. And you had different formations, different enemies, different, every house in Jenin refugee camp where the Battle of Jenin happens was rigged to blow, and they were losing soldiers. And that really dictated the type of warfare. Yes, if you have, I can say kind of conclusively, although it really matters, that if you have a embedded defender who is prepared to die in defense of the city, and you have to pry them out. And there's a real, even General Townsend and General Miller and others about the Battle of Mosul, is when you got down to that last little bit, it didn't matter if the building was dropped or whatever, you had to go in and pry every defender out, and the destruction actually assist in the defense. That's true from Stalingrad till now, is that just because you bomb a city doesn't mean that you achieve your goal. It actually makes it harder to get to the enemy if they're in there and you have to get them out. There are some, I guess, characteristics of that, but there have been cities that have been won even against ISIS where you just signal that you're coming, and ISIS has left the cities. And that actually happened during battles in Iraq against ISIS, where they were successful at messaging like, look, you need to leave the city now before we come, and it's destructive. But if you get in there, and I think this is really where Gaza, even if you look at Stalingrad, Aachen, Ortona, all of these highly destructive battles, is that if the enemy, whoever's defending it, has had time to prepare it for that reason, it usually becomes a much more destructive battle, right? And this is, even if you go to one of the few operational level papers ever written by General Scales, he recommends just get to the city first. You don't let the enemy prepare to defend it, right? There is that element of speed, where like Stalingrad, it's immediate engagement. Aachen, a couple weeks. Mosul is the most destructive battle since World War II because ISIS had 2 years to get it ready, and the Iraqi government said, well, we can't handle this ourselves, and ISIS prepared for 2 years. So if you fast forward to Gaza, same thing for Fallujah, right? First Battle of Fallujah, and then you wait for 6 months. For 6 months, the few amount of terrorists in that city prepared and made it a very highly destructive battle. If you fast forward to Gaza, Jenin was an example. And you're right. Even if you look at the Battle of U.S City in 1973, where the IDF attempt to go into the city and they really they learn a lot of hard lessons. Gaza is an urban terrain, unlike any other one that I've ever studied, because the enemy prepared for those battles. It built many of the urban environments for the sole purpose of warfare. And that's about 20 years of preparation. So there's actually, unless you go back to like ancient warfare where you build city-states and castle walls for war, there's no modern example of an enemy preparing an environment for 20 years for the sole purpose of fighting.
this is probably a good point at which to segue into a discussion of Gaza per se. And John, I wonder if you could, there are two questions really. One, if you could compare a little bit our experience with our Iraqi partners, which was mostly the counter-terrorist force, as I recall, in Mosul, and maybe Fallujah too, where we told the population to get out. I mean, in Fallujah, Second Battle of Fallujah. So when we went in, it was pretty much all combatants. There were not that many non-combatants in the city. But if you could compare sort of how the IDF has operated and how we approached it in terms of the collateral damage that we've seen, and then to your point about the long 20 years of preparation, and I know you've written about this, it involved not just the urban terrain above ground, but the construction of massive tunnels below ground. And one of the things I've heard from Israeli colleagues who've been involved in this is that the so-called Gaza Metro, this maze of subterranean tunnels, turned out to be deeper and much more complex and far-reaching than anybody had realized, which made the degree of difficulty here, that much greater. If you could comment maybe a little bit on that as well. Sure,
that's tough. So if you take Second Battle of Fallujah, 2004, November 2004, you're right, massive months of evacuation, which is similar to even the Battle of Talafar 2005, Ramadi 2006, although Ramadi was fought a little differently. But the Second Battle of Fallujah, where you had a division going against basically 3,000 terrorists from many parts of not just Iraq. It was a hotbed of terrorism. And then what we did under General Madison, and I interviewed now General Rainey, who is one of the task force commanders, to basically penetrate the enemy defensive and go into the city. But we also were heavy on air defense. There's no tunnel networks. We penetrated into the middle of the city, turn around, still had a bloody fight, still highly destructive. You're right, though, in most of these battles, they're counterinsurgencies. So there's Iraqi support fighting with us and also immediately transitioning in the battles. All the work of preparation for, during the operation, but also within minutes of all the assistance and messaging, information operations. If you get to the Battle of Mosul, so one, the scales are a lot different, right? So you have Fallujah, a city of 400,000, 90+% evacuated. You're right, mostly combatants left, although there's usually historically about 10% of every population, doesn't matter what, stays in for whatever reason, for many reasons. If you fast forward to Mosul, that's a lot different. It wasn't just the CTS or the Golden Brigade, although that was the only force that the Iraqi government had that really could take on the operation, and they paid a heavy price. I mean, it was the counterterrorism service that we, the U.S. military, had trained. We hadn't really trained the Iraqi military for contested urban warfare. We had trained them to fight other armies in the open plains, going back to the way we think we make militaries like us, who think like, there's a lot of problems here that come to head in the battle against this radicalized, what did the city of Mosul mean to ISIS, everything. And, we really don't have an accurate number of how many fighters, 3,000 to 5,000 is the echelon, but it took 100,000 Iraqi security forces. So it wasn't just a CTS. It was, Peshmerga, it was Shia militias, it was a whole list of actors, which became its own political nightmare of having a kind of a joint operations cell with all these groups that hate each other or have their own intentions for after the battle, but they're all aligned to defeat ISIS. That's part of that, being backed by the world's greatest military, not just the U.S. military, but others. And how when you got down to really central Mosul city, it did become this very protracted. We ran out of Hellfire missiles because we were using precision-guided munitions, but there's something called the precision paradox, where if an enemy like ISIS, who did have a few tunnels, it started to connect buildings with mouse holes, that just because you can target a building The enemy's in that building. He just moves to the next building. You end up dropping every building along the block. And there's a lot of destruction in Mosul if you've seen the photos, despite all of the resources. So 100,000 security forces, all of that air power, it became that very protracted. Fast forward to Gaza, and it took 9 months. So just to be clear, it took 9 months for 100,000 security forces backed by the greatest air power in the world to get 3,000 to 5,000 ISIS fighters to liberate that city, basically. Fast forward to Gaza, there was going to be no comparison, and you did have 30 to 40,000 Hamas only fighters who had built, in my estimate, over $1 billion of tunnel networks. And you're right, as somebody who had been in Hezbollah tunnels, run tunnel conferences in Israel before the war, what actually ended up being there far was greater than even Israeli scholars had imagined based on past operations in 2008, 2014, 16, 21. I was on the ground in 2021 during Operation Guardian the Walls when the IDF thought they had destroyed 50% of Hamas's tunnels by the air. One, that's not possible, and there's some issues there. And even what Hamas learned from that operation was to put in more blast doors in their tunnels. There's never been, across any urban warfare, but in warfare in general, 400 miles of tunnels ranging from just underneath the buildings to over 200 feet underground. And to be clear, at about 200 feet, there's really no military munition outside of, like we saw in Iran, a very advanced penetrating munition that can reach that depth. So 400 miles underneath every structure, basically. Every step I took, now I've been in the Gaza 4 times, in Netrine corridor, Khan Yunis, everywhere. It's more likely that every step you take, there's a tunnel underneath you. And I've written about, it's really unique how the underground was more important to the military of the other force than the surface. So the IDF could take the surface and still be fighting for months an enemy that is underground because of how hard it is, and they've evolved their approach. Just from those, if we set aside the tactical, the political elements of even the population in Mosul, going back to 2016, at the beginning of the battle, the Iraqi government tells the entire population to stay there. It tells 850,000 civilians in the city of Mosul, we don't have anywhere for you to go, stay there. As the battle progresses forward, and it's seen as the nightmare that it would be to fight within the population, they are told to leave, and there is a capability for them to leave. In that sense, so the physical terrain, totally different. The scale of the enemy, totally different. The underground networks that are going to make it really hard to get to the enemy. And where are your hostages? Where is the leadership of the enemy? It's all underground, was going to make, and I wrote this in November of 2023, one of the greatest urban warfare challenges of military history, let alone the tactics of the enemy. ISIS in Mosul, it was using human shields. It actually would create protests, or not protests, but like it would make people gather in front of them, part of like a messaging thing, or they would hold people in buildings. But they never told the population or the world that I'm going to try to get as many of these civilians killed, my civilians. And to be clear, Mosul was a Sunni-leaning city in which ISIS took control of and used that divide between the government and their population to rule for 2 years. Nobody's ever fought a war where the enemy on the other side is saying, I don't care about these people. Matter of fact, I want these people to die so that I can achieve my political goal. And this is for the tunnels, going back to my experiences in Ukraine, when Russia invaded Ukraine and gave no notice, and there were millions of civilians trapped in urban areas. They sought refuge in the tunnels. If you believe there's 400 miles of tunnels in Gaza, which there is, that's pretty much a fact, every individual, every civilian could fit into those tunnels with no problem. But there's not been a record of a single civilian being allowed in those tunnels. So that should really tell you about how the contextual elements of fighting this enemy is a lot different than Fallujah or Mosul.
You know, I was in my last trip to Israel was in December, and we got into at least part of Gaza, and I was talking to the head of the Gaza division. And he said it was really quite striking. He said, first, he said, maybe we've discovered 50% of the tunnels, maybe, but he said I wouldn't even be too confident about that. But then just the kind of cross sections of the tunnels, and tunnels below tunnels below tunnels, quite extraordinary. So let me ask you then a somewhat different question. My impression is, all things considered, the Israelis actually have done remarkably well. I mean, they're going after a force that's the equivalent of, maybe a couple of divisions of light infantry that have been preparing for this fight for a very, very long time in the way that you described, that are fanatical, that don't care about their own civilians. And yet, the war is still going on, and certainly civilians have been killed, which is terrible. But that on the whole, the Israelis seem to have been able to certainly defeat Hamas in a meaningful sense, and to do it without, simply massacring hundreds of thousands of people. So how did they do that?
Yeah, I agree
with that characterization.
John, before you answer that, let me add one quick point to Eliot's question, because it goes back to something you said earlier about the cognitive dimension and the information environment, which is, I quite agree with Eliot's characterization of the Israelis, and I know you've written about how they've adapted and evolved their approach over time. But on the information side, it seems to me that they have been getting their heads handed to them by their adversary, and that they are, losing an enormous amount of not just international support, but even domestic support for military operations in Gaza. So if you could comment about both elements of it, both the operational dimension, but also the information dimension.
Sure. The information dimension will be complex, but I definitely get the question a lot as somebody who's now studied, and I'm very vocal on at least being objective to the facts, whether it's a genocide accusation or the aid distribution or whatever it is in information operations. But it started on October 7th to include people saying that Gaza is the densest place on earth, and that's USA. Those are some major publications making that statement. And like I study cities for a living. Have you people not even traveled to India or anywhere else? Gaza is not the densest place on earth. It has some highly dense areas. But on Eliot's first question, I agree with that assessment, that the IDF, if you look at what we call the sit temp, basically, of the enemy, right? So Hamas alone, right? And I had to give a lot of people like a War 101 class for the last 2 years on what is a combatant and what is non-combatant. When Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th, Israel declared war against Hamas, the political and the military government organization. That means they are, you can target Hamas, doesn't matter what they're doing. But also, if you enter a combat area and somebody partakes in the hostilities, like shooting at the IDF or holding hostages or something, that there are many other people who have joined in Hamas's fight, right? The Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Lion's Den. There were more, thousands of civilians crossed the border on October 7th. The operational situation of Hamas was 30 to 40,000 fighters, had 5 brigades, 24 battalions, 20,000 rockets. It launched like almost 10,000 rockets at Israel since October 7th. And it is a actual correct statement to say the IDF have actually militarily done quite well in destroying Hamas's military capabilities. We can talk about the tunnels, and I agree with that assessment. I think they probably found, destroyed less than 50% of the tunnel networks, but that, to me, that's an accomplishment. Hamas doesn't have the military. And again, going back to the very beginning of the podcast about why is this so hard? A lot of times it's your military thinking about urban warfare. The IDF hasn't just been doing raids. The IDF is built as a raiding military. Even if you look at its responses to the 6-Day War, Yom Kippur War, you name it, it is active defense and then raiding against the enemy and pulling back and refitting. It's what it does. It's like at the core of its cultural thinking. And I think that's one of the things that I picked up in traveling the world, is that there's an explanation beyond the variables here, that there's just a way of thinking for that military. So this gets to even what we talked about earlier about the aversion to occupying ground, right? Even if you believe in General Petraeus, who it took us 6 years in Iraq to figure out the basically population-centric clear, hold, and build strategy. That was 6 years into the war, and it was proven, but there wasn't an aversion to doing that. In Gaza, there's an aversion to occupying ground with civilians on it. They are a raiding military, and they will clear ground when they move all the civilians out of harm's way. The IDF, even in this raiding in and out tech, which I actually teach operational templates for offensive assaults of urban areas. There are many ways you can surround it, and all these things. And this raiding one is one I've had to create because it's a IDF way to do it. And they were very successful. It's intelligence driven, eliminating leadership and military capabilities and brigade strongholds and all these things. Two, Hamas doesn't have a military today. So I agree with that. But in order to achieve the political goals, and this is why I wanted to interview the prime minister, the chief of staff, every echelon to make sure I understood what the political goal was and how that was translating into the military goals. They're very clear on what the goals are. Now, strategy to apply the ends, ways, and means to achieve those political goals. They definitely have it down on how to eliminate the Hamas military capabilities with a low cost variable, because even if you go to these other battles I've mentioned, like the Battle of Mosul, the Israeli or the Iraqi military paid a huge price to fight the way they did. The 10,000 casualties die in the Battle of Mosul. The IDF have lost, if you count October 7th, about 900 soldiers in the greatest urban warfare challenge that any military has faced in modern history. That's a positive for them. But in order to actually remove Hamas's military capabilities under all these constraints, if I don't talk about this, I would be remiss. In every urban battle, and there is a difference between a battle and a war. I've never studied one where not only can the civilian population not get out, they are trapped there by another country. And this is Egypt. So people criticize how IDF has fought this war. They played the statistical numbers, which is just so uninformed about civilian to combatant ratios and all this stuff that is, you're trying to vilify the way the IDF fights or the way that Israel fights. But the fact that the civilian population, if they decide not to participate in the hostilities, still have nowhere to go. They're not allowed to leave even if they want to. That in itself makes this really hard to compare to other means. Hopefully that covers, I think the IDF have been successful. I think the IDF have a cultural aversion to some of the things that even I would do differently even at this point. And that includes like what we call the ink blot strategy or the bubbles. And they're all versions of this clear, hold, and build strategy that I know why the IDF haven't done it. To include they're fighting other wars, right? So this would take tens of thousands of soldiers, and they've had to fight other wars while they're fighting Gaza, right? So they've had to send divisions north. They've had to have people ready to fight in other areas and fight Iran, all these variables. Information operations. So it's easy to paint the brush very broadly to say that they're horrible and they've lost narratives, and at many times they absolutely have lost narratives. They haven't fought in the narrative. And as I've tried to peel back that onion in my research of like talking to the IDF spokesman, why aren't you doing this? When you talk to a government organization, why aren't you doing this? There is an element here that this is a young country where the civ-mil divide is very vibrant. It's a vibrant democracy with a very, unlike our political framework in which how often the government can fall if it was set up to be, that lends to this Venn diagram of why aren't you better at telling your story? Why aren't you better at communicating what your goals are in the world, or the war, and what you are doing every day? But this is also a war being fought. Yes, and I'm sure we will. We'll criticize Israel the government for not communicating even when the narratives go horribly wrong to the point where there are strategic consequences. Although I argue, some people say that they're putting their national security at risk because they're being isolated. I have other data that I would say counterreacts that, right? Their ability to uphold the Abraham Accords and fight Iran and break apart the Ring of Fire, do against Hezbollah, all of this stuff. That's a part of that equation. But this is also a war at a scale, and really, first Battle of Fallujah is like a kernel of what's about to come, where you have social media driven, nefarious media personality activating narratives that have strategic consequences, right? So this war has been fought on the phones of every uninformed, useful idiot in the world that in a democracy, especially like those in an election year, matters. And that's unique for me as a war researcher of war being fought where a single event becomes a global story, like the bombing of a hospital. Whether it does or doesn't happen, immediately the story is told and then spread around the world. That's not new in warfare, but the speed of it and the reach of it is new. So Israel absolutely failed in communicating in the information operations space. We would have done it differently. Even the embedded journalist program that we didn't start until way later in our career is a way, right? If you look at the first Battle of Fallujah, there's 0 media embeds. It goes horribly wrong. Second Battle of Fallujah, there's 60 media embeds. There is an advantage to that, but I also have cases where Israel did embed a media journalist in an operation, and then they would say just the most crazy things about what they're actually seeing in front of them. That it becomes like it's not black and white. Yeah, absolutely, they should have learned their lesson. They're still learning it over and over again. But it's not so clear as people, I think, try to make it, as in they're just bad at this.
Unfortunately, we're running close to the end of the show, which is a real pity. I wonder if we could move off Israel, Gaza, and could you talk about Ukraine, particularly the ubiquity of drones on both sides, and is that a kind of new wrinkle on urban warfare that is really significant, or is this just another set of devices that people use? I mean, it does strike me that how much of the Ukraine war has been fighting about cities, and in some cases fighting in cities or towns. How has that changed some of the fundamentals, if it has at all?
It's a great question. I used to teach a class on what's the difference between a revolution in military affairs and an evolution, and the impact of technologies on warfare and war in general. I personally, and one of the reasons that I went to a place called Nagorno-Karabakh shortly after the 2020 war is because the lesson that people had learned about the war is that it was the world's first drone warfare, and that couldn't be the farthest from the truth that I've ever studied in research. That battle in 2020 was a artillery, infantry, tank penetrating lines of contact war as I've ever seen. That also had some drones that were effective if you didn't have counter drones. Having now been into Ukraine as well, I mean, Ukraine had a vibrant drone program before 2022 that it was evolving, and also a technology to integrate those civilian off-the-shelf drones into a common operational picture that we don't have. It's called Delta, that can take the sensors from within a civilian environment and quickly integrate those into the military to use limited resources. But the problem with Ukraine, and I'm sure Eliot and Eric, you've discovered this, especially for Western militaries observing operations and wanting the lessons, is that there's been so much that's happened that whatever your pet project was, you can now say, like in Ukraine, whether you're an air power guy or whatever, you can say, or whatever it is, like in Ukraine, without the telling the story, and it's true with breadth and context of even the drones. Why are drones so pervasive? And you're right, 90% of artillery called in by drones, a high percentage of actual identifying the death. But the drones aren't the leading cause of death, but they're pervasive. And one of the reasons is because both sides don't have air supremacy. Or so one of these, we were asking this question, like, why is Ukraine so good at this? But the better question is, why is Russia so bad at this? Why is Russia so bad at an integrated air defense capability around even their forward troops? And now you have fiber optic drones. I actually like to take the drone question and apply it across multiple combat areas, right? So take the drone question, apply it to Nagorno-Karabakh, India during the India-Pakistan war, Gaza, Lebanon, you name it, and you get a better picture of course, drones are a evolution of capability across every warfighting function. Doesn't matter, not just air power and ability to drop things or be able to see things, but in every form of intelligence, reconnaissance. Now the infantry in Gaza, they don't go into a building at all. They send a drone first, and usually then they send a drone with an explosive next. And when they went into Lebanon, they had somehow not transferred that lesson to Lebanon, so they had to do some recalibration. The drones are a factor of warfare as much as artillery and bullets are. And if a military deploys on a modern battlefield and it doesn't have as many drones, ubiquitous disposable drones, and they're going to be found wanting on the future battlefield. But it isn't that you can only invest in drones and you're good, because that's not the leading cause of tactical casualty producing things. It's still artillery. Artillery is still king of the battle. We've learned that in Ukraine, of course, and I'm doing it now of whatever it is, like in Ukraine. But the evolutions of the fights in Ukraine, and General Petraeus's book, again with Andrew Roberts, was really quick to point out that the defense, kind of like urban warfare, is almost like is passed away. Like you have a NATO, right? The greatest military alliance in modern history. It's a defensive alliance, and all they talk about is attacking. Nobody's defending. So in Ukraine, it started with Ukrainians defending their ground, and why I wrote that manual. You can really use a lot of resources to defend terrain. It evolved to Ukraine having to go on the offense, and to teach a military that goes from 100,000 to 1 million how to do combined arms breach of multiple phase lines of defensive. It's really hard to do, let alone if they had the capability, as in the equipment to do that, which they didn't. To the point where now it's a little bit of everything. You have line defensives of, just like I saw in the Nagorno-Karabakh, or we saw in World War I, like multiple lines of defensives before you even get to that urban battle, which does become the decisive battle even today. Drones are a part of that, but there's an electronic warfare fight here. There's all of these elements to where you have really some of the drones on the water are to me more impactful from a research perspective and more innovative than just the evolution of these drones that can see the enemy, which then can call in the artillery if you have it, and that can range it and all these parts. You could do 40 lessons of an academic year on just the evolution of drones in Ukraine at this point.
Well, I wish we had more time because there's so much more to talk about. But John, this has been a wonderful kind of introduction to the general topic of modern urban warfare, and clearly from what we've seen going on in the Middle East, what we see going on in Ukraine, you clearly have lifetime employment. I mean, this is
I hope so.
This is not going away. So
I will. One thing we didn't cover that I know you two probably have seen. It's only because I've been studying urban warfare. I've also studied the conversations of trying to ban warfare, right? So this was the evolution of have your battles wherever you want. Just don't have it in those urban areas, right? These NGOs, United Nations groups who have obtained immense amount of power, but it translated for the first time I've ever seen, like the conversation about the 2,000-pound bomb. I knew exactly where that conversation had come from on, you can't use these type of weapons in urban warfare, no matter the enemy situation. We could do a whole episode as well on that. Why is that making urban warfare so hard and there's a really famous Colin Gray statement about the intentions of all this leading to greater destruction, when you start taking away and believing that the introduction of a new law or a new restriction will cause less destruction when you're actually causing more destruction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. This was
thank you.
Yeah, this was grim, but fascinating.